You don't lose power because you're weak. You lose power because you talk too much. And the most dangerous thing is you don't realize it's happening every day, in every small conversation. Every time you try to explain, try to prove, try to clarify yourself, you're inadvertently pushing yourself to a lower position in the game. Not because what you're saying is wrong, but because the position of the person speaking is already a weak one. In social interactions, the most common reaction when misunderstood is to speak up. When doubted, we explain. When attacked, we refute. When manipulated, we try to regain control with logic. But that very reaction is the biggest strategic mistake because it puts you in the role of someone who needs validation, not someone who is shaping the game. Power doesn't come from saying the right thing. Power is born from forcing others to adjust their behavior in your presence. And to do that, you don't need to convince anyone, nor do you need to win the argument. You need something more subtle, colder, and more effective. That is recalibrating the other person's perception through behavior, pace, and deliberate silence. The human brain is programmed to predict. In every interaction, it silently builds a model of you, how you will react, what you will say next, whether you will defend or attack. And that predictability is the first weakness to be exploited. When you react immediately, you are providing data. When you explain too much, you are perfecting their predictive model. The more data they have, the more control they have over the situation. The more predictable you are, the safer you appear in their eyes. And in the world of power, safety means not being intimidating. But when you stop, when you don't respond according to the familiar script, when you remain silent at the right time, not out of fear, but out of control, you create a predictive error in the opponent's brain, and the brain hates error more than anything else. This predictive error forces them to rethink you, who you are, what you're thinking. Do you know something they don't? The lack of information causes their brain to expend energy analyzing instead of attacking. At that very moment, the tide begins to turn. In behavioral psychology, people assume that those who speak little but act consistently tend to hold a higher position. Not because they are mysterious by chance, but because they don't need to prove themselves. In the military, units that communicate less but make decisive decisions are always considered more dangerous. No one fears an opponent who talks incessantly. People fear the silent observer. Silence here is not avoidance. It is suppression. And suppressed signals always carry more weight than exposed signals. When you withdraw yourself from the conventional communication economy, where people exchange words constantly, you disrupt their entire familiar rhythm. The opponent begins to be more cautious. They consider every word. They adjust their tone. They worry that they may have said too much or revealed something they shouldn't. Meanwhile, you don't need to do anything. Just maintain a stable state. This is the moment power begins to form. Not because you win an argument, but because you become an enigma. And in every social structure, the unknown is always treated with the utmost caution. The following section will delve into something even more dangerous. Not silence, but emotional asymmetry, where you maintain a stable nervous system while the other party escalates and reveals their own weaknesses. Most conflicts aren't decided by logic. They're decided by who expends more emotion. The one who loses their temper first loses control first. And in most cases, failure doesn't come from saying the wrong thing, but from your nervous system being pulled into the other person's rhythm. Emotional asymmetry occurs when one side maintains a stable state while the other constantly escalates. One person speaks faster. One person explains more. One person begins to use emotions to compensate for inner uncertainty. And as soon as that happens, the roles are reversed. A stable nervous system always sets the pace for the entire interaction. No formal authority is needed. No social status is needed. Just that you aren't infected by the other person's emotions. When you don't chase the other person's fast pace, you force them to slow down to synchronize with you. In intelligence and interrogation, there's a core principle. Stay silent long enough for the environment to speak for itself. The most talkative person in the room is usually not the one controlling the situation. They're the one trying to fill the void with emotion and anxiety. And in the process, they reveal information. This technique is called signal extraction. You don't ask, You don't contradict, you don't confirm or deny, you simply remain neutral, long enough for the other person to begin adjusting their behavior. And when people don't get feedback, they expose themselves. You'll hear a change in tone. The rhythm becomes more rapid. The tone takes on a defensive quality. The words begin to sound justifying rather than assertive. This isn't accidental. It's a sign of unease surfacing. It's important to distinguish clearly. This is not apathy. Neither is indifference. This is a state of non-reaction. You are still fully aware, still observing, still understanding what is happening, but you refuse to let external stimuli connect with and control your internal state. In Buddhist psychology, this is the foundation of inner freedom. What cannot be connected cannot be controlled. When the words, attitudes, or emotions of others no longer have the ability to trigger your inner reflexes, they lose their most powerful tool of manipulation. They no longer know which direction to push you in. Emotional asymmetry doesn't need to be outwardly displayed. There's no need to appear cold. There's no need to appear arrogant. Just don't increase the intensity of your emotions in response to their intensity. You maintain a low, stable, controlled energy level. And the paradox will occur. The more someone tries to draw you into their emotions, the more they reveal that they are losing control. The more someone explains, the more they show they need validation. Meanwhile, you don't need to prove anything. From this point on, the roles are completely reversed. You are no longer the reactant. You become the static surface, allowing all of the other person's fluctuations to reflect back onto themselves. And that's when you begin to see the true nature of the situation, clearer than any words. The next section will touch upon the element that makes people both respect and be wary. Not absolute silence, but principled unpredictability, where you are consistent in your values, but never let others read your next move. People don't fear power. People fear what they can't predict. And ironically, most people try to be understandable, predictable, and easy to grasp, hoping to be accepted. But that very predictability makes them the first targets of exploitation in any power relationship. Predictability begins with always reacting in the same way, always explaining when doubted, always giving in when tensions escalate, always displaying clear emotions to reassure others. Over time, you become molded into a familiar pattern of behavior. And once you're molded, you're no longer a threat. To master the game, you don't need to be chaotic. You need to be unpredictable, but within limits. This is principled unpredictability. Internally, you maintain stable core values. Outwardly, your actions are always flexible and not repetitive or formulaic. Studies on leadership show one thing consistently. People tend to submit to calm individuals, but they are not entirely readable, not out of direct fear, but because they don't know where that person's bottom line is. Controlled ambiguity creates a natural zone of caution around you. The biggest difference between principled unpredictability and erratic behavior lies in internal consistency. Erratic people react emotionally. Principled unpredictability acts according to internal norms, but doesn't publicly display that logic. You don't change your values. You simply refuse others access to your behavioral map. When others can't predict your next move, they can't plan against you. Every manipulative strategy needs a pivot point, a familiar reflex, a recurring weakness. When those things disappear, the entire informal power structure around you begins to crumble. This doesn't make you distant. On the contrary, it makes you more noticeable. People begin to think before speaking to you. They think before challenging your boundaries, not because you threaten them, but because they're unsure what response they'll get. This principled unpredictability turns you into a strategic enigma. Not an enigma for cheap curiosity, but an enigma that forces others to adjust their own behavior to avoid making mistakes. In this arena, you don't need to assert your position. Position is established through the caution of others. From that point on, power is no longer something you have to demand. It becomes a natural consequence of how you present yourself. You don't need to control anyone. Just don't let anyone control you. The next part will delve into a more subtle level, where you compress your identity, give up performing, give up explaining, and step out of the communication economy. That's the line between image building and truly existing. Most people are not controlled by others. They are controlled by the image they try to maintain in the eyes of others. Every time you feel the need to explain who you are giving the power to define yourself to the outside world. And at that very moment, you are no longer at the center of the game. Identity suppression is not hiding. It is deliberate reduction. You reduce external signals to increase internal clarity. Instead of constantly updating a new version of yourself for those who are only familiar with the old version, you choose silence and consistency. In the modern world, many people confuse existence with performance. They build a personal brand. They tell the story of their journey. They hope for recognition through being seen and understood. But the more they perform, the more they are drawn into the communication economy, where everything requires feedback. The difference lies here. Performing is living to be validated. Existing is living without explanation. When you stop providing continuous expressive signals, others' attempts at classification, labeling, and control begin to fail. Others don't know where to place you. They are no longer certain about your role within the old system. And when classification fails, the soft power they once used to keep you in a familiar position also loses its effectiveness. You don't need to break the structure. You just need to no longer fit into it. Compressing identity creates a form of counterpressure, not offensive pressure, but existential pressure. Your presence becomes denser, less signaling, but more weighty. Every small action is observed more closely because it is no longer wrapped in explanation. This requires high inner discipline. You must accept being temporarily misunderstood. Accept that you won't always be recognized immediately, but in return, you reclaim ownership of your identity. No one has enough data to manipulate how you are perceived. When you step out of the communication economy, you enter the space of proactiveness. You are no longer an object to be defined by others. You become a self-referential entity, and the world is forced to adjust to that presence. The final part completes the reversal cycle, where micro-adjustments of behavior and detachment from outcomes help you put on an invisible armor. Not to attack, but to avoid being drawn into unnecessary games. True power doesn't lie in winning or losing a conversation. It lies in the fact that the outcome of that conversation no longer determines your self-worth. When your identity isn't tied to the other person's reaction, you enter a state of strategic freedom. This is when detachment becomes your strongest armor. Detachment isn't retreat. It's freedom from the constraints of outcome. You no longer need to be agreed upon, recognized, or understood immediately. And that's what makes all your actions sharper and more precise. At the micro level, power is expressed through very small things: the rhythm of your voice, the speed of your response, the pauses between responses. When you speak slowly, clearly, and with a measured rhythm, you force the listener to adjust their attention to you instead of you running to their pace. Delayed responses are one of the strongest signals of autonomy. Those who respond immediately are often perceived as always available. Those who intentionally pause are seen as prioritizing, not because they are deliberately playing hard to get, but because they are not swayed by the urgency of others. When you maintain this state, you will begin to see a change in the environment. The other person explains more. They are more careful with their words. They regulate their emotions to avoid crossing boundaries. No one asks them to. They do it themselves because they sense a fixed point. This is the moment of emotional contagion reversal. Instead of you being drawn into the tension, aggression, or chaos of the crowd, your own composure becomes the new standard. Emotions no longer spread from them to you. They spread in the opposite direction, from you to the environment. At this level, you don't need to impose. You don't need to speak up. You don't need to prove anything. Your steady presence is enough to force the world around you to adjust its pace. And that is the most sustainable form of power because it doesn't depend on anyone else. My personal view is very clear. In an increasingly noisy world, the one who controls the silence controls the direction. Not through manipulation, but through inner discipline, self-control, and the ability to avoid being drawn into unnecessary games. The final question for you is not how strong you are, but how much energy you are wasting resisting futilely. Will you continue to run at the pace of others, or will you become a fixed point where every rhythm is forced to adjust around you?